Today is Friday, January 14th, 2022, which means it's Whispers Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? This has been a bad week for breathing, but a good week for writing. I've managed to get several chapters of Station 3 written, as well as more narration on the Black Oceania. Patreon, Ko-Fi, and Buy Me a Coffee subscribers will be in their 4th episode today, and I'll be pushing them out to the $10 folk as fast as I get them recorded. So what else is going on? Well, I have a recommendation for you. There's a nearly 3-hour documentary on Shudder regarding the history of folk horror. It's called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched. In addition to providing an overview of the history of folk horror from around the world, although it primarily focuses on American and European traditions, the documentary mentions a ton of authors I'd never heard of and are named as luminaries dating back to the 1800s. It's a pretty good overview of both the cheesy films and books made in the genre as well as the ones that will forever stick in the Western psyche. Interested? Go to Shudder.com and check it out. With that, how about we get back to Vaughn and his own little horror story? Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 2 of Whispers. After several minutes, he felt as though he wasn't getting any closer to the glow. He had to turn Suit's lights on in order to keep from tripping over unseen obstacles and smashing Suit into the rocky surface. Each time he did, the glow disappeared in the backwash of light. He began alternating, taking his time to map out the terrain before shutting off the lights and waiting to find the glow. But something wasn't right. The longer he walked, the more the glow seemed to stay right where it was, as though it were creeping backward from him for every step he took toward it. When he next looked at his chronometer, it gave him a start. He'd been walking for more than 30 minutes and hadn't even noticed. His oxygen reserves were already down past the 3/4 mark, and if he kept walking like this, he'd quickly run past 50%. Point of no return is what they called it. Neat, tidy, nondescript term that meant you couldn't get back to where you started. He glanced to his side and saw a short cliff face with a deep overhang, similar to the one he'd seen near the shuttle. Vaughn groaned. The first wave of drugs was wearing off. Shock was no longer much of a concern, but he was tired and everything hurt. Concussion, severe collision trauma, suits, even combat models could only do so much. Acceleration, velocity, and gravity didn't care what you were encased in. They did their damage any way they could. Humans were simply not built for that kind of sustained abuse. Vaughn eyed the cliff again, sighed, and walked beneath the overhang. He put his back against the cliff wall, trying not to panic. The glow was still there on the horizon, shimmering as though mocking him. Vaughn continued watching it, losing himself in its hypnotic shimmer. It was soothing, and he began to relax. He was going to die, and there was no reason to be panicked about it. That would just spoil the time he had left. He closed his eyes for just a second. A sound like unrolling packing tape squealed through his mind. He tried to open his eyes, but they remained shut. Tingles of fear spread through the world, but he had become completely unaware of his body. This was all in his mind. The sound roared again as though pumping through the very dendrites and neurons connecting his thoughts and consciousness. The tickle of sharp, delicate scalpels ripping through gray tissue that might once have been.
Oxygen reserves at 25%.
The synthesized voice rattled through his ears and startled him into a near seizure of surprise. Eyes darting from side to side, hands gripping his rifle too tightly, he looked for a threat, something to point at and shoot. But there was nothing. He regained control of his heartbeat as well as his breath. If he kept panting, he'd run through the atmosphere even faster. He wanted to stick around a little longer, watch the shimmer, but the shimmer had disappeared, leaving him staring out into near absolute darkness. Apart from the annoying warning message flashing on his HUD, there was little to see. His lights might as well have been off for all they illuminated. Confused, he shined Suit's lights down at the ground in front of him. Same rocky but giving surface. Same veins of vibrant colored ore, or whatever it was. He panned his helmet following one of the veins. That's when he saw the seam. There was no shimmer because the overhang he'd been sitting beneath had shut like a crunching maw, locking him in. Sharp waves of panic arose from his balls and erupted from his mouth in stuttering whimpers. What the fuck was going on? Was he dreaming? Was he... The rocky floor vibrated, and Vaughn reached for something to grab hold of. With his back to what he'd once thought was a cliff face, the vibrations jumped and tweaked his spine, his own incomprehensible gibberings rising and falling in time to the rhythm. It might have only lasted a second or two, but it felt as though it went on for forever. By the time it stopped, his heartbeat was racing at a suicidal rate.
Vaughn,
Suit said.
Please slow your breathing.
Fuck you. He said the words through a pant, mouth clicking from dehydrated tissue. Suit responded by flashing a new alert on his HUD. It was the symbol for a heart, its thudding beat slightly slower than his. He focused on the holographic image, willing himself to catch the beat. It worked. Within 10 seconds, his heart had slowed enough for him to actually think. Another few seconds and he felt much less panicked, more in control. What the fuck is going on? Suit didn't respond. Something moved across the back of his suit. Vaughn froze, half afraid to peer at his rear suit cam. He held his breath, clenched his teeth, and forced his eyes to focus on the tiny window at the bottom of his HUD. The wall he'd been sitting against was melting. He leaped up and was nearly 5 centimeters off the ground before realizing he was still in low gravity. Just before he smacked the top of the new ceiling, he hit the jets. His boots slammed into the floor, but instead of experiencing a hard jolt, the rocky surface flexed. Another surge of panic rocked through him as he waited to sink through the floor into the gullet of some massive monster. A moment later, the floor solidified just enough to keep him from sinking more than a few centimeters before gently raising him back up to floor level. Vaughn's heart tried to race again, but he firmly clamped down the panic. Think. If he hadn't been wearing a helmet, he would have slammed his fists against the side of his head. A mouth. I'm inside a goddamn mouth. More movement in the rear cam. Instead of glancing at it, he slowly turned until he faced what had once been the cliff wall. The rock, or whatever it had been, had melted like butter in a warm skillet. He stepped away from the oozing matter, the panic animal growling and howling in his brain. When his back hit the mouth's edge, he screamed.
Oxygen reserves at 20%. Please slow your breathing.
Funny, he didn't feel like he was breathing too fast. He felt more as though his entire body had seized, frozen in space and time, and that what was playing out before him was nothing more than a vivid hallucination. But he was breathing. He was screaming. Vaughn's throat burned, the pain from shouting too loud lancing the back of his throat. The heart symbol appeared, and he tried to catch the beat. Tried. Vaughn saw more movement in his peripheral vision, but dared not look. Focus on the heart. Suit gave him a verbal cadence, and he willed his heart to match the beat. Slow. Finally back to 85 BPM. But the ice in his veins and spine hadn't departed. The terror lying just beneath his calm gnawed at him with rat fangs. The reason was right in front of him. While he'd been following the heart's bouncing beat, desperately trying to regulate his runaway breathing, the wall he'd once leaned against had completely disappeared. The substance, whatever the fuck it was, had melted and swept up to the other walls surrounding him. The stuff once again looked like rock. What are you? Vaughn asked. The collapse of the cliff had revealed what appeared to be a tunnel. No, he thought. More like a gullet. Staring into the darkness, his suit lights incapable of finding the end of the tunnel, Vaughn felt another pang of terror trying to wrap its way around his mind. Don't lose it, he told himself. Suit will be pissed. A brief glance at his HUD told him he was at 18% oxygen. If he rationed it, he could probably stay alive another hour or two. That meant not moving. Hell, barely thinking, let alone defending himself. He could die here in the goddamn mouth of this thing, or try to find a way out. You're dead either way, a voice said in his mind. That wiped the look of indecision from his face. The voice was right. That particular little voice always was. Vaughn tried to grin and was surprised at how easy it was. He flexed his fingers and realized he'd been tightly gripping his rifle since he regained consciousness. His knuckles ached as he tried to get his fingers limber again. The rifle was probably useless, but until he knew that for sure, he was carrying it like a soldier. If nothing else, he could bring a friend along with him into the void.